Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome business legend Jim Rogers to Brexit Watch. Jim is an American investor and financial commentator now based in Singapore. He is the chairman of Beeland Interests, as well as the former co-founder of the Quantum Fund and Soros Fund Management. Jim, welcome to Brexit Watch.
I'm delighted to be here, Jonathan, but I just quickly tell you, I have not been at Quantum Fund for over 40 years. So that's not, you might as well ask me about my first wife. That's not the least bit relevant to my life.
Okay, all right. Well, that's duly noted.
Important. Let's go forward.
Duly noted. Okay, Jim. Well, before we get into the meat of our discussion, I'd just like to take this opportunity to wish you and your family well during this unprecedented coronavirus crisis. I know quite a few people in Singapore. I'm aware of the situation there. How has the current crisis impacted you and your work over the last few months?
Well, I'm at home. Nobody can go anywhere. Normally, I spend a lot of time traveling around China, Japan, Korea. I've got a couple of books coming out in Japan, which I can do nothing about now, for instance. So basically, I'm a homebody. I'm staying at home instead of visiting. And Russia, I go many places. That's the main effect it's had on me so far.
So we're all in the same boat as far as that's concerned.
Yes.
Now, sticking with the crisis, Jim, how would you assess so far the handling of the crisis by the US government as compared to other Western nations and countries in the Asia Pacific?
Well, we'll know in a few years. Sweden did nothing and has suffered some. They say they're going to come out ahead. Some U.S. states did nothing. They say they're going to come out ahead. We know that the U.S. has the highest number of deaths, the highest number of cases reported anyway, if you can believe anybody. And I'm always skeptical of believing anybody. But on the numbers, the U.S. has done the worst job, or the least good job of handling the whole thing. You know, if you go to Asia, you mentioned Asia, well, Korea is opening up. Korea hasn't had too much of a problem. Japan is opening up again. I live in Singapore. Singapore had a good record, had some problems, is getting better. Taiwan seems to have done a great job. But Jonathan, you believe any of them? You know, you believe the British government? I have no idea who's doing a good job, who's doing a bad job. But on the numbers that are reported, the U.S. is doing the worst and Asia is doing least worst, based on what is reported.
What about the economic response, Jim? We look at what the US government and the UK government have done. We look at the Federal Reserve. How would you assess the economic response?
Well, the whole world is going into a serious economic problem. We're going into the worst economic problem we've had probably in my lifetime. I have been on record as saying the next time we have an economic problem, it will be the worst in my lifetime. I didn't know the epidemic was coming. I said that based on, in 2008, Jonathan, we had a problem because of too much debt. Well, since 2008, the debt has gone up everywhere, every year. So it seemed to me pretty clear the next time we had a problem, it had to be worse. Well, here it is. It is worse. Economies were already slowing down, and then this happened. And the fact that there's so much debt makes it a very, very serious problem. If there weren't it'd be a problem, but if there weren't so much debt, we wouldn't all be hanging out the window saying, oh my gosh, what next? So this is not just in any country you want to pick, because everywhere it's the worst economic problem we've had in your lifetime and in my lifetime. And it's going to get worse.
So what do you see as some of the major economic and maybe political ramifications going forward?
Well, whenever there's a crisis, it always leads to change. You're probably going to see some governments go bankrupt, some political parties go bankrupt, some countries go bankrupt. It always happens. This time it'll probably be worse because everybody has so much debt, as I said. You know, in 2008, China had a lot of money saved for a rainy day. It started raining and China started spending the money and helped save the world. Even China has debt now. So I don't know who's going to save the world this time. The Scots? I don't know who's going to save the world this time around. No, it's going to be problems for everybody, and you're going to see surprises. You're going to see bankruptcies in China, which is going to surprise a lot of us. It's going to surprise me. And I just told you, it's coming, Jonathan. Everywhere is going to have some serious problems.
Talking about China, Jim, I know you've been generally fairly bullish on China. So this question really comes in two parts. One, given what you've just said, are you still as bullish on China? And two, how do you see the crisis impacting future relations between the Western world and China?
My bullishness, as you put it, on China has been that China is going to evolve and become an extremely rich and important country. Even the people who hate the Chinese, I presume, would have to acknowledge that that has happened and that is continuing to happen. In my view, China is going to emerge again as the most important country in the 21st century. I'm not saying that because I love or hate the Chinese. I'm saying that because I'm looking at the world. I'm not investing based on my desires. I'm basing on what I see as reality. If there are people who say that's not going to happen, I'm just happy to discuss it with them. But so far, it has happened. I don't see anybody else emerging the way China is emerging. China will certainly have problems. No question about that. America became the most successful country in the 20th century. But Jonathan, along the way, we had several depressions with a D, civil war, little rule of law, massacres in the streets. You could buy and sell congressmen. Well, in America, you can still buy and sell congressmen, but they used to be cheap. It was very cheap 100 years ago to buy and sell American congressmen. So America had many problems. China is having and will have problems as it rises, but that's the way the world works. The UK became the most successful country in the world at one time. You had huge problems along the way, but you succeeded.
And what about the future relationship, Jim, between the US and the Western world on the one hand and China on the other? There seems to be a bit of a desire among some people to give the Chinese regime a kicking, certainly to hold them to account. So how do you see that shaping up?
Well, I think I'm astonished of it because China and the West should be working together to have great prosperity. That was happening 2 or 3 years ago. But throughout history, Jonathan, when things start going wrong, politicians look for somebody to blame, and they always blame the foreigners. Always. Any country, any time in history, because the foreigners have different languages and different skin and different religions and different food. Oh, and they smell bad, and their food smells bad. Can I tell you how many times I've heard people say, oh, and those foreigners, their food smells bad. So it's always very easy to blame foreigners, and it always has happened everywhere throughout history. The world is having problems again, so the ones who are having the problems blame the foreigners, and in this case, the Chinese are the obvious foreigners to blame. It's not good for the world. Is it legitimate? I mean, blaming the virus on the Chinese is, I mean, America had a virus in 2009 called the H1N1 virus. We didn't close the airports. We didn't close McDonald's. I didn't hear people racing around blaming the Americans for the virus. You know, in 1918, we had the biggest flu virus in history. It started in America. Nobody closed down. Nobody started saying we're going to boycott the Americans because this virus started there. I mean, unfortunately, epidemics have happened throughout history all over the world. And the idea that I know what we'll do, we'll blame them. That won't solve the virus. It won't do anything. It won't bring more prosperity. It won't make the world better at all. China, the West, Japan, all of us should be working together to cure the virus, but also to have prosperity again.
I suppose what people are thinking is these reports we hear that the Chinese were hoovering up PPE face masks before as the crisis was unfolding. They could have done more. This is what we hear. I think that's probably why people want to hold the Chinese to account, saying the Chinese were allowing flights to go out of the country at a time they should have been stopping them. Understanding what you just said about the H1N1, etc. But I think that's where people are coming from when they are lambasting the Chinese government.
Wait, that the Chinese were hoovering face masks?
Well, that they were buying up face masks. Some reports suggest as the crisis was unfolding.
Well, okay, I don't know your propaganda sources, but everybody knew the virus was there. It's not as though it was a secret. It was reported to the whole world in early January. America certainly knew about it. America did nothing till March. It was all over the worldwide press. And as you know, America didn't even have test equipment until March. Now, is that because of China? I mean, I find that very, very strange. Since we all knew about it, we all could have bought masks, etc. There were masks, there was equipment, there were ventilators, there was everything. But I'm an American. I don't like saying this, but America did nothing until March. That's because of China? Okay.
I suppose that leads into another thought and another question. I've heard some suggestions that this crisis could see a new manufacturing renaissance. It could see the fast tracking of automation in manufacturing in Western nations, perhaps based on what you just said, this sense that somehow countries in the Western world have become too dependent on China when it comes to manufacturing, and that's why they had PPE shortages. That's why they had ventilator shortages. So, what do you think of the possibility of perhaps it's put a bit grandiose, put it like this, a new industrial renaissance in the Western world coming about because of this?
Well, it could very well happen. People could bring in the U.S. Again, I'll talk about the U.S. since I'm American. People could bring manufacturing back home. I don't think many foreigners that want to buy American televisions or American most any product, because America demonstrated we were not terribly good at it. We weren't very efficient. We certainly weren't very cheap in producing many goods. But if we want to bring it back, we certainly can, and we can. Mr. Trump will probably guarantee jobs or guarantee investment, but that's not going to make America competitive. People will have jobs, and maybe we will all watch television sets or something made in America, but I don't think you're going to find a lot of Brazilians or Germans or Japanese buying those American products, and it will just make America go further and further into decline, because unless something happens dramatic, I don't know how America is going to suddenly become competitive again. There are many problems, the tax laws, the litigation laws. There are many laws in America which make it very difficult to be competitive. Hooray! Yes, do it, Jonathan, do it. If you can do it, we will all, kiss your feet. But it's going to do more than just saying, okay, we're going to make these things in America now, and therefore the problems will be solved. Do it.
Before we leave China, just one more question on China. How do you assess the current leadership of Xi Jinping in the country? How that's changed the country compared to his predecessor, and the situation currently in the country, particularly with regards to the Uyghurs?
Well, in 1978, Deng Xiaoping said we've got to try something new. And you know the rest of the story. The next 40 years, China became the most successful country in the world. I mean, an absolute miracle. It's a little bit like what happened in England in the early 1830s. I mean, just astonishing success, prosperity, wealth developed for everybody. And that's certainly happened in China since Deng Xiaoping said, let's try something new. In the recent years, not in the last few years, China seems to be closing off a bit. Now, history shows the more open you are, the more likely you are to have prosperity and success. I mean, you've heard of Alibaba. Well, Alibaba's because there was some boy who went off into his bedroom and started playing with a computer. And that led to Alibaba and Tencent and Baidu and some great stories in China. Yep. We all know that opening up is good for your economy and your society. I hope they're not closing off. There are some signs that they're less open than they used to be, certainly not Deng Xiaoping anymore. And if that, but so is America closing off. So is, unfortunately, so is everybody. You know, throughout history, Jonathan, we've had periods when the world opened and opened, like the 19th century. Great for the whole world. In the 20th century, we had a period there where in the 30s anyway, the world closed off again. You know the rest of that story. It led to disaster. We've been opening for the past few decades, but now many countries seem to be closing off again. That history would indicate that's not good for any of us or any of the countries that are doing it.
I wonder, Jim, I mean, there's two ways the crisis could play out when it comes to opening or closing. Some would say this is the crisis has proven the case for stronger borders and perhaps being more self.
What? So prove the case of what?
Stronger borders, looking more inwards, sort of closing off, the reverse of what you just said. And there will be those who say potentially this is a case for yet more cooperation, more internationalization. I wondered what you thought about that, whether the crisis would lead to more opening up or more closing off.
As I said before, politicians go a long way by blaming foreigners. Rarely do they go along and say, let's open the borders and let's let everybody come in. Unfortunately, that's not the way. It would be better. That's the way to be successful, but that's not the way history works, unfortunately. You know, in 1962, Burma was the richest country in Asia. 1962, Burma was the richest country in Asia. And they said, throw out the foreigners, let's close off, to hell with them. 50 years later, Myanmar was the poorest country in Asia. I mean, history is full of examples of closing off and going into decline. History is full of examples of opening up and prospering. America, we gave people land if they would come to America 150 years. We said, come to America. I live in Singapore. Singapore did everything it could to attract smart, successful people, educated people. And you see what happened. Singapore's been an enormous success. The countries that have closed off went into serious. In 1957, Ghana was the richest country in the British Empire. They said, get rid of the foreigners. 10 years later, Ghana was bankrupt. The dictator, the leader was thrown out. I mean, history's full of examples of closing off and going into decline and opening up and prospering. But it doesn't matter what I say. As I said to you before, history shows that there are many periods when the world opens and many periods when the world closes.
How did Japan and South Korea fit into what you just said, Jim? I mean, obviously they became, South Korea became a superstar economy after the Korean War, and yet both countries, even with incredibly low fertility rates, Japan obviously has a declining population. They have never sort of opened their borders up, as it were, but obviously both have prospered.
Yes, but let's go for the next step further. First of all, Japan, I've just written, had 2 #1 bestsellers last year. I mean, I'm shocked to tell you this. I'm surprised to tell you. I'm almost embarrassed. And I got 3 more books this year in talking about the problems, the decline in Japan. Japan has had declining population since 2010. That's 10 years now, and there's no sign it's going to change. And the debt is skyrocketing. in Japan because they keep borrowing and spending all this money to maintain just what you said. But it was all based on closed economy, closed society, closed everything else. And it worked for a while, but it's not working now by any stretch of the imagination. As I said, the debt has just skyrocketed beyond comprehension, and the population's in declining. Now, this is arithmetic. Subtract the population, add the debt. That's not good. In 50 years, there's not going to be a Japan unless something dramatic happens. Yes, everything you said they did, great. For 30 or 40 years, they did a protected, closed economy, very, very rigid and disciplined, and it worked for a while. I'm giving you my view is it's now coming to an end, has come to an end. The Japanese stock market, for instance, today is down 50%, 50, that's not a typo, from 30 years ago. Somebody thinks something's wrong in Japan. I didn't control the stock market in Japan. 50%, 50. Somebody thinks there's something wrong in Japan. I know all the numbers you just talked about. Yes, and they were great. It was fantastic. It's one of my favorite countries in the world. I love Japan a great deal.
Yeah, me too.
Korea, South Korea, the same way. South Korea was a disaster for many reasons. And in the last 40 or 50 years, yes, but Jonathan, South Korea is the size of what? Not Wales, maybe England. It's a very small place. I can tell you, I know in America it's the size of the state of Indiana, which is not a very big state. But Jonathan, in South Korea, there were dozens of American military bases, building highways, building ports, building airports, because of the, quote, war. So if somebody comes to your country, the size of Indiana, and spends hundreds of billions of dollars on infrastructure, chances are you're going to be successful if that kind of things happen. And Japan, South Korea has certainly been very, very closed. It's one of the most closed economies in the world, more so, maybe more so than the Japanese. I know people say they'd rather do business in China than in South Korea, because in China they can get things done. South Korea, it's almost impossible. So yes, everything you just said was true, but it's coming to an end. I guess you know it, South Korea is certainly coming to an end. I happen to be extremely optimistic about Korea, the Korean Peninsula. Once the 38th parallel opens, it's going to be the most successful, exciting place in the world for 10 or 20 years. Because you have, in the north, you have lots of disciplined, cheap, educated labor with lots of natural resources on the Chinese border, and in the south you have manufacturing capability, capital, etc. 80 million people on the Chinese border, so it should be a very exciting place to be. Because of protectionism, well, maybe, unlikely. It might work for a while. Protectionism has now failed in Japan, and protectionism is failing in Korea. The reason I say that Korea would be great is because they would have to open up. They got a new frontier. Any place when you have a new frontier, you're successful for a while, for all the obvious reasons. So that's why I'm optimistic about the Korean Peninsula once the 38th parallel opens up. And there's the word again, open, not closed. Closed Korea is going in. Closed Korea has serious problems now. I mean, get out the statistics and you will see what's happening. South Korea has one of the highest rates of suicide in the world right now. Young South Koreans, you know what their number one aspiration is? It's to work for the government. Now, how many 18-year-olds do you know who say, someday I'm going to work for the government? Ah, what a wonderful aspiration for teenagers anywhere in the world. But that's the number one aspiration for South Korea. if they're not committing suicide, they want to get a job working for the government. And as I said, the highest rate of suicide, I think the highest, or certainly one of the highest, is in South Korea. Young people as well as old. So that's the result of protectionism and closing off.
Jim, let's leave the whole coronavirus situation and for a moment, and let's bring things a bit closer to my part of the world. This is Brexit Watch, after all. As you said, you're an American and you now live in Southeast Asia. I'd be interested to get your take on how, as an outsider, you have viewed the phenomenon of Brexit, and what your assessment has been over the last decade or so of the European Union as an institution.
Opening the borders anywhere is good. Well, you've heard me say that opening is good. So opening the borders in Europe was and is good, and opening trade. Free trade has been great for the world throughout history. And having a single currency is great because it's much more efficient and cheaper and everything else. However, Brussels is a disaster. I once said to Nigel Lafarge, listen, you're exactly right about Brussels, but what you should be doing is having a vote to get rid of Brussels, not to leave the EU, because you could be very powerful in the EU. What you got to do is get rid of Brussels. And now, of course, more and more countries are coming to realize, oh my God, these people in Brussels, who the hell are they? What are they doing? And so you're having more and more separatist movements in Europe. The idea of an open and free market is great, and a single currency is great. Brussels, oh, what a disaster. What a disaster. You can figure out a way. You can figure out a way to close down Brussels. In UK especially would be very powerful and dominant in an open market. But unfortunately, there's no way to close down Brussels. So you took the path of least resistance. So I hope that it comes out well for the UK. UK is one of my favorite countries. I've had some of my greatest triumphs in the UK. So I hope everything, my daughter's in boarding school in the UK right now. So yeah, no, I'm very, very keen. But Brussels is a nightmare. And Nigel was right. I just wish Nigel could have abolished Brussels instead of the other course.
Do you think you mentioned the currency, having a common currency is a good idea? Do you think that, even considering the differences between, say, the economies of Northern Europe and the economies of Southern Europe and the economies of Eastern Europe, quite different places, do you still think having a common currency would be a good thing for Italy, Spain, and Germany and the Netherlands?
Everything you just said was true of the United States. Huge differences. We had a huge war, internal war, 135, 50 years ago. And the differences in the regions of the U.S. were much bigger than the differences in Europe now. And yet, America pulled it together. We had a single currency. But by the way, before, everybody, you could have your own currency. Each state could have its own currency, etc. But as the market opened and developed, the single currency came to dominate because it was more efficient for people and cheaper for people. And you know the rest of the story. A single currency, a single market, and the U.S. prospered. Before, it wasn't the way it was in the U.S. As I said, each state could have its own currency, and many of them did. Anybody could print whatever money they wanted. You could have internal barriers to trade, and many states did. You know the rest of the story. The market opened into a huge internal free market, and the U.S. became very prosperous. Of course, I know the difference in the Finns and the Portuguese, and therein lies part of the problem. In Brussels, they say to the Finns, you have to be like the Portuguese. And the Portuguese say, what the hell are they talking about? We don't want to be like the Finns. And the Brussels says, you have to do what we say, and you have to do it our way, and you have to be like each other. That's insane. But had they just let nature take its course and a single currency and a single market, of course there would have been people who had problems and complaints. But in the end, an open market would have adjusted and adapted, and that's what capitalism is all about. That's why capitalism has been the most successful or the least unsuccessful system there is in the world, because people do adjust and have to adjust. They don't have some bureaucracy somewhere saying, okay, eat finished food, whether you like it or not. You know, markets take care of themselves. Brussels does not understand that. And I assure you.
I certainly, sorry.
You what?
Oh, sorry, I thought I thought I was interrupting you.
No, go ahead, interrupt.
Just going to say, from my perspective, Jim, you know, it is the lack of a demos in Europe that is the problem. You know, I could understand, for example, you mentioned
lack of a what? What was the word you used?
Demos, a common sense of nationhood. I mean, you mentioned the United States, but obviously the United States did speak the same language. They didn't have a history of having spoken different languages, a history of having been at war with each other, a history of different cultures. You know, from my perspective, if the democratic mandate was there, I could understand the Belgians deciding to sort of split in two, one side going to the Netherlands, the Dutch-speaking side, the other French-speaking side going to France. I could understand that, but it is the lack of a demos in Europe, from my perspective, which makes the whole political union unworkable in the long run. And if it had just been about economic integration, the European project would have begun and ended with a free trade association. We have it in Europe. It's called EFTA. Norway, Iceland, Switzerland are in that association. So from my perspective, if it had just been about trade, it would have begun and ended with trade. But where we certainly agree is that the top-down approach by Brussels has been a failure.
I just want to add to you, because most people don't know this, but America is known as a nation of immigrants. Mm-hmm. The reason for that is, well, first of all, everybody who's there is an immigrant, sooner or later, but after 1865, people from all over the world came, and there was no common language. There was Little Italy everywhere. There was a Little Italy. Most cities there was a little. There were Germans. There was Germantown in New York. They didn't speak English. They spoke German. There were Chinese. There were many immigrants from all over the world in the United States, and they spoke their own languages. It would be heaven. I mean, you sound like an American civics class put out by the U.S. government saying, "Oh, we were all that's." Garbage. That's balderdash. We had massacres in the streets. We had Antifa. We had laws saying that the Chinese could not own land, could not own property, that Asians could not own property. No, there were all kinds of laws against foreigners, and none of them spoke English. Now, their children spoke English. Their grandchildren spoke English. But, and as you well know, I'm sure you well know, if you travel in Europe, English is the common language. I don't speak any European languages, but everywhere I go, I have no problem speaking English, including Russia. So your way is fine, and everybody's open to their own views and own approaches, but no, English is already spoken and the French hate it. As you know, you go to France and you speak English, they hate it.
Therein perhaps lies the problem.
What?
Therein perhaps lies the problem. You know, the fact that they may resist it, the fact that these are indigenous languages to the various countries of Europe, which is obviously a different situation to the immigrants coming into a new country, a newly created country in the United States.
Well, they adapted, the U.S. adapted, and the U.S. became quite prosperous by adapting and having everybody adapt. If you had gone to Mississippi 100 years ago and tried to compare it to California or Maine or something, I mean, you were on different planets. So just as you were saying They're different planets. The European Union is a different planet made up of different. Well, America was probably worse, but certainly as bad 100 years, 150 years ago. And there was no common language.
Now, Jim, regarding Brexit and regarding what has happened, what do you see as an outsider? Again, your take as an outsider, bringing your experience into this debate. What do you see as the economic opportunities for the UK going forward? Not just given Brexit now, but obviously factoring in Brexit, but also given the current crisis. Do you see any? What do you see as the major economic opportunities?
Well, the Scots may leave. Now, I'm not answering your question directly right now, but the Scots may leave. If the Scots leave, the Northern Irish are going to leave. And that leaves England and Wales. I'm not sure what England and Wales have to sell to the world. But I do know they have education and the English language to sell. That will continue to be an opportunity, but it's already there. But you don't like foreigners, so you don't want the foreigners to come there and learn English. But English language will continue to be a stupendous opportunity for England if you let them come and learn English. But if you split up again, I don't see many opportunities. The UK, as we know it now, has huge debt. Huge debt. I mean, you're one of the most indebted nations in the world on a per capita or any basis you want to look at it. I don't see many opportunities for the UK except to open up. I hope you do. I hope you open trade with Asia. I hope you open trade with America. The UK became successful as one of the great trading nations of the world. I'm sure you know English UK history. Mm-hmm. England ruled Britannia. Britannia rules the waves. Well, you rule the waves because you had trading everywhere. You were a great trading nation. You're going to have to do that again because the city of London has to go into decline now. The Europeans are not going to say, well, you left the EU, we're going to do all of our financial business in London. Well, no, that's not going to happen. They're going to take it away from London.
I think they'll be able to, Jim. Do you think they'll be able to take that business away from London, or do you think it's too well established in London?
Well, it's established, and this doesn't happen next week, but it's established in Frankfurt. It's established in Amsterdam. It's established in Paris, too. It's not as though in Frankfurt they don't know about international finance. No, of course. But is Brussels going to say, oh, let's continue to push our money towards London? You think everybody's going to say, let's push our financial business towards London? Maybe they will. I cannot conceive of that. These other cities and centers have, not London, not New York, but they do have financial capability. And they will now have their own protected web of saying, well, we're German, so we should do our financial business in Europe. Is this good? No, I'm not in favor of it. But I'm just telling you how the world will work going forward. So the only future I see for the UK is to become a great trading nation again. The problem is the world is a little different now than it was in 1820. And it's not going to be as easy. But if you close off more, I don't see a great future, especially if things start happening like the Scots leave, the Northern Irish leave. And I want to tell you again, Jonathan, some of my best the best parts of my life have been in the UK, especially England, to be precise. Do I like to see this? No. Hope it doesn't happen. I hope that somehow the UK becomes a great trading nation again and is as prosperous as it once was 100, 200 years ago. You may have heard, many people have quoted me often that I said in 1807, if you were smart, you moved to London. In 1907, if you were smart, you moved to New York. In 2007, if you were smart, you moved to Asia. I hope that we can continue to have prosperity in the UK, in England, UK, and in the US. But I also see what's happening in history. So opportunities, a great trading nation, English language, to sell the English, and the English language is a great asset, by the way. No, great asset. Everybody still wants to learn English. And you, you say you speak the best English, and people do want to learn your English. So that's your great asset, which nobody, America can duplicate. Australia to some extent, but you have a great advantage. But you have to exploit it. You can't say we don't like foreigners coming here to study.
Well, we certainly, the tone we get from the UK government is the desire to have to be global Britain, to reach out to the world. We've got US-UK trade talks underway at the moment. What do you think of the prospect of those, given what you've just said, and also the idea of Britain reaching out towards the Commonwealth countries, particularly the likes of Australia and Canada?
Well, yes, do it. You will need raw materials in the UK and Canada and Australia have raw materials, and you all speak the same language and you have the same queen. So yes, it can happen. Open up as much as you can. I've just said to you, I hope that the future prosperity of Great Britain, as far as I can see, is international trade again. And those are places where there's a match. You need raw materials, they have raw materials. It could happen and it could match. I don't know what you're going to manufacture. Are people going to buy English motorcycles again? I don't know. English cars again? I don't know. You import iron ore from Australia, but what are you going to make with it? Minis again? I hope you find something, but as I say, that would be fantastic. Those two countries have great advantages. They could work with you, but remember, those two countries together have 50 million people at most. That's not a huge market. Better than nothing, but you're going to need more than a 50 million people market to make Britain great again.
One final question on Brexit, Jim. You may or may not be aware, because of the crisis, there have been a lot of calls in the UK, some within Brussels too, all the shoulders to the wheel on the coronavirus crisis. Let's push back the transition negotiations. Now, we were talking before the interview started. Britain is currently in a transition period. So it's in the single market and the customs union. It no longer has MEPs representation in Brussels. This transition period is due to end on December the 31st. A trade deal is currently being talked through by the UK and the EU, mostly, but I think all by video conference. From what we hear in the British press, there have been a lot of issues with this, with these talks. What would you say, if anything, to the idea that Britain should push back, or the UK and the EU combined should push back the transition deadline past the end of this year into 2021? Is that just kicking the can down the road and prolonging the inevitable?
Well, I don't know what the reason to kick it down, to delay it is. I'm certainly, I told you, my view would be go back in, abolish Brussels, because there are many people who would agree with your approach now. There are lots of people in Europe now who are not as happy with Brussels as they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And I'm sure that if Nigel went back and said, let's get rid of all these jerks, there are a lot of people that say, that guy's right. We thought he was nuts, but now we know he's right. And that has happened many times in history. So yes, I would hope, if there's a reason to delay it, delay it. But I don't understand the end game to delaying it. I don't understand what you would hope to gain by delaying it, unless if there's something to gain, then delay it. But if there's nothing to gain, then maybe you should go ahead and get out, take the new reality, and adjust to the new reality. But again, I don't see the end game. You would have to explain to me what's in it for Britain.
Well, I'm not one of those who wants to delay the transition deadline, Jim. This is more on the people, I think, who generally didn't want the UK to leave in the first place, and also feel that too many resources are committed to fighting the coronavirus. I think those are the people who are arguing to extend.
Well, again, if there's something in it for the UK, sure, but it may be, often in life it's best to go ahead, accept the reality, and get on with the new life. I mean, people get divorced, and sometimes one of the parties wants to stay and says, "I'm sorry, let's start over." But it's usually best to start over and get a new life instead of trying to hang on to something that's finished. I tell you what I would do. I would go back, say to Brussels, "Come here, we're back again. Now let's abolish Brussels and we, the British, are smarter than all of you," and you are. And you would say to them, "No, we're going to get rid of Brussels. I promise you." There are lots of people in Italy and France and Spain and in Finland, many people who agree with you on Brussels now. Not 10 years ago, not 5 years ago, but now they do. But that's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen. We'll have to see what the future looks like.
That's not going to happen.
We definitely agree on that. Jim, one final question, tying everything together that we've discussed, the coronavirus, Brexit, if you had one major economic or political prediction, or indeed social prediction for the man or woman on the street, over the rest of 2020, next 6 months, next 9 months, what would that big prediction be for the future?
You better be very careful. I would suggest you become knowledgeable to what's happening, because what's happening is not good. And once you become knowledgeable, you will get worried. And once you get worried, you will prepare for the problems that are coming, and then you'll be okay. You know, sometimes disaster leads to opportunity for many people. And so I just urge everybody watching this to please understand what's happening in the world. We're not talking about you now, I'm talking about the world. It's going to lead to a lot of problems in the next decade. Be ready, be prepared, and then you'll succeed.
I think that's a good note on which to leave it. So, Jim, thank you for joining us today on Brexit Watch. We appreciate your time.
Jonathan, it's my pleasure. As I say, I'm a great fan of the UK. I'm a great fan of England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. I'm a great fan of all of you, so keep it up.
So my thanks to Jim Rogers, and thank you for watching. If you'd like to find out more, go to www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Twitter and on Facebook. Until next time.
Watch Brexit Watch.